Hi, everyone. This is Ellen Bristol, President of Bristol Strategy Group, with my colleague, George Khaldun. And we're going to continue our discussion from our earlier series where we talked about what are the challenges, what are the social problems we're facing, and what is the role of nonprofit organizations for addressing and ameliorating them. Today, we want to discuss what we're not currently doing to solve those problems. And it's always a conversation between me and George, but I want to start out this time talking about funding and how funding could be improved. I don't just mean more money. I mean tackling the funding of not-for-profit organizations from a strategic perspective. Does that make sense, George?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Since this is my area of expertise, I've done an awful lot of research, and I try and stay up to date with what's going on out there. And what I see all the time are tactical solutions to strategic problems. So we have tons and tons of how-to training, resources, consultancies, but very little, comparatively speaking, on the higher level stuff, which translates into assuming we're going to be very successful, what amount of money do we need to achieve the desired impact? I believe that you and Jeffrey Canada did a deep dive into that question when you issued your original RFP to funders to ensure the long-term success of the Harlem Children's Zone. That's correct, right?
That's absolutely correct, yes.
So I wanted us to talk about two interwoven problems. One is the overhead myth, and the other is the tin cup mentality. I think everybody's aware of the overhead myth now. We've been, in this sector, we've been trying to counter the predilection for many foundations and United Ways and the like, who have declared that maintaining one's administrative overhead at a very low level is what justifies making gifts. And I was very glad to see a few years ago, some of the big funders got together and including Charity Navigator, who's not a funder, but a major watchdog agency, and said, wait a minute. Overhead ebbs and flows with the company's growth and resiliency, and perhaps squeezing our overhead down to a very low number is not altogether realistic. Did you guys ever have to put up with the overhead myth at Harlem Children's Zone?
One of the things that many nonprofits have to have is a good board, and the board oftentimes, if it's a good board, there are some business people from the corporate sector on those boards. So whenever that question arose about overhead and the number of staff we had, the nonprofit has to be able to justify the fact that they had to hire a data person, or they had to hire an IT person, or they had to hire someone, a child psychologist. So it's up to the nonprofit to be able to justify the staff that they bring on. If they have 500 staff or 1,000 staff and they're only working with 10 children, that doesn't work.
That doesn't work.
So the nonprofit has to show, look, we're working with 10,000 kids. Therefore, we had to hire 3 social workers, a data person, and an IT person in order to be effective. So it's up to the nonprofit executive board or president or their board of directors to be able to show clearly why there is overhead and how you are extending or expending your funding. And in most cases, people can understand it because in the nonprofit world, they are able to justify why you have the staff by showing so many numbers of sales. So the sales went from 1 million to 2 million. So you brought on more, I had to bring on more staff in order to manage that additional sales. So in the same we have to do in a nonprofit. We got to show that we're working with 20,000 kids. Therefore, we had to bring on more social workers, hire a data person, hire an IT person in order to make our organization effective.
And you probably had to also invest in an HR person and better
Absolutely.
Technology.
Yes, it goes on and on. Right.
Right.
And then you have to, over a period of time, justify the outcomes. So
Correct.
What you're working with 10,000 kids starting in January. So in December, what happened with those kids? What was the progress? Did they go from grade 1 to grade 2? Did they start school on grade level? Did the question of crime go down among your kids? Those are type of data points you have to present to your board of directors or to others to see that you are using their funding effectively.
In my years in the for-profit industry, something that was drilled into everybody's head, no matter how far down the organizational hierarchy your job might be, there was a mentality around the wonderful phrase, can you make a business case for this? You know, everything short of a bereavement leave or a heart transplant, you had to be able to muster the data to prove the anticipated benefits of the investment. And that's what you're talking about.
Right, cost-benefit analysis.
Cost-benefit analysis. And I would really love to encourage more nonprofits, especially the 80% of US-based and registered nonprofits that operate below that $100 million, $50 million, even $20 million level. The largest proportion of nonprofits is way down there at $1 million or under. And they should, like you guys did, start out with tooling their ability to make a business case for whatever it is they do, as opposed to running around and trying to do things on a shoestring, on nothing, on sacrificing the CEO's time and salary, on getting by with AmeriCorps volunteers. P.S. I'm very much in favor of AmeriCorps and Vista volunteers. But when you need a more senior person with a broader range of skills, you don't put an AmeriCorps volunteer in charge of corporate relations, for example.
Absolutely, yes.
So money and people are joined at the hip. And where I spend a lot of my time thinking about how nonprofits understand fundraising and deploy the wide array of mechanisms available to them, and there are many. You're kind of the expert in recruiting, retaining, and managing people. So these two things go hand in hand because we know people are coin operated and we can't always expect them to work for a pat on the head. So
absolutely not. Yeah.
Can you address this issue?
Yeah, the way I look at it is that the whole question of recruiting and, more importantly, retaining staff is absolutely critical. And for profit and nonprofit, is how you are able to motivate new staff that you bring on. And so it begins with the leader, in my opinion. It begins with the leader, it begins with the manager, meaning that you must be someone of high integrity. Your staff have to see you as someone who's fair, who is just, and who genuinely cares about you and your development on this staff. If you're an IT, or if you're a vice president for development, or if you're my CPA, or if you're my person who cleans the halls every day or washes the walls, you have to show a sense of humility, a leader has to have, and integrity and genuine respect for your staff. And once you're able to show them that you respect them as human beings, and then you're able to connect them with the mission. And if the mission is improving the quality of life for people in your community, and then that staff is more than willing to be motivated, they will listen to you, and they will go above and beyond which is required. But it begins with the leader and his or her ability to be humble, to be sincere, to be clear, and when things are not going right, to be honest about what's working and what's not working, and find out why it's not working, and try to encourage and train that person so that they can become a better employee, so that those things are not working begin to work. And this all begins with motivation. It begins with your ability to connect with staff, being humble, but being fair. And so in this way, we're able to have a successful staff, a successful mission in terms of the organization's objectives and goals.
I can't agree with you more. There's a well-known business consultant named Chris Argyris. He's no longer with us, unfortunately, but he wrote a powerful article called "Why Smart People Can't Learn." And one of the basic things in the thesis of this article is that without humility, all else is lost. So the leader's humility is, we don't talk about that enough. We really don't. So I wanted to ask you before we end our conversation right now, why are not more nonprofit leaders ready to deal with their staffs?
I think it's because, number one, a lot of them have grown up or have the idea of a military leader. Do as I say do, and not what I do. Yeah. Do it because I said so. Do it because this is what I want to, way I want it to happen. And if you don't do it the way I want it to happen, you're out of here. And that type of quasi-military leadership style is a style that turns off a lot of people. And I think that developed in the early 50s and 60s and 70s, where you had at some point a lot of military people going into business and being consultants to major corporations. And I think that that type of logic and thinking filtered down to others in terms of the nonprofits and profits about how do you motivate people, kick them in the rear and tell them if they don't do it, they're out of here. That type of mentality is what has destroyed a lot of organizations. And people have to learn how to lead. And Steve Jobs, when he first started his Apple, he was that type of leader. Do as I say do, or get out of here, or you're fired. You know, you didn't get
off with his head,
or you're out of here. and they fired him eventually. And
Right.
he started a couple of other companies. And when he learned through working with firms that he started, when he came back to Apple, he was more humble. He was one, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? He became a different type of person, which allowed him to really help create the iPhone and others, is because he showed people respect. He showed his engineers, his people respect, his design people. He gave them the respect that they deserved. He treated them humbly, and therefore he was able to produce.
Sometimes I can't think of a more, being fired from the company you founded will create humility if nothing else does, right?
Absolutely.
It's a great example. So what do you recommend that nonprofit leadership do to improve outcomes here? Because finding people and bringing them, really engaging them is not an easy task.
It's a tough task, and you have to look at it as a tough task. The role of a leader, according to Napoleon, is to define strategy and give hope. And so a leader has to be able to define the strategy in terms of what we want to do and give hope that it will happen. And by giving hope and talking to his staff and getting them to think differently, then they're able to move forward. And that's one of the things Steve Jobs did. He defined the reality, what was happening. People needed to have a phone that they can carry around, that they can use as a mini computer. And he gave hope, meaning that we can do this together. So these are the things that leaders have to do: define reality and give hope.
I love that, which leads us to something we're going to talk about in great detail in our next meeting, which is that defining reality, laying out the vision, and giving hope don't actually translate directly into effective execution. That's the role of management. So what we've done so far in this conversation is to discuss that areas where we're lacking or maybe struggling in our sector are strategic approaches to funding the operation and funding it generously so that people aren't sort of, using 12-year-old technology and furniture that you picked up off the street, and leaders whose perspective is to give hope while remaining humble. So in our next conversation, let's tackle the stuff that I think needs a whole big fat shot in the arm in the nonprofit sector, which is executing the vision through enlightened management. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense, and I'm just looking forward to the next session.
Thanks so much, George. We'll talk again real soon.